Part 2, the trials, scandals, and headlines that destroyed careers. Hollywood didn't need a courtroom to destroy a star. In the golden age, one headline could unravel a career faster than any judge's sentence. A single accusation, true or not, could ignite a national frenzy powerful enough to erase a lifetime of work. Studios tried to manage the fallout. Publicists lied, lawyers begged, but once the press turned a name into a target, there was no escape. Some of these actors were proven innocent. Others were never charged at all. Yet every one of them paid a price far harsher than prison. They lost their reputations, their careers, and in some cases, their place in Hollywood history. And it begins with a man who was once America's most beloved comedian, until scandal turned him into Hollywood's first great exile. Number 1, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle, the innocent man Hollywood never forgave. Before the scandal, Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was one of the biggest stars in America. A comedy giant whose films packed theaters and whose charm made audiences forget the weight behind his name. In the silent era, only Charlie Chaplin matched his fame. He was adored, trusted, and seen as a harmless entertainer who made the world laugh during difficult times. But in September 1921, all of that changed in a single night. Arbuckle traveled to San Francisco with friends for a weekend party at the St. Francis Hotel. There were drinks, music, laughter, a typical celebration for Hollywood's new royalty. Among the guests was Virginia Rappe, a young actress whose career was beginning to gain momentum. At some point during the party, Rappe fell ill, suffering severe abdominal pain. She was taken to the hospital where she died a few days later from complications of a ruptured bladder. The moment the news broke, the story twisted into something monstrous. Almost overnight, Arbuckle became the villain of a crime he didn't commit. Hearst newspapers, the most powerful media empire of the time, saw an opportunity. Sensational headlines sold papers, and Arbuckle's fame made him a perfect target. They printed fabricated stories, lurid details, and accusations so graphic that they shocked the entire country. America didn't wait for facts. They made up their minds instantly. Roscoe Arbuckle was guilty. The city erupted in outrage. Churches called for boycotts. Politicians demanded his execution. Theater owners burned his films in the street. Overnight, America's most beloved comedian became its most hated man. Arbuckle was arrested and charged with manslaughter. What followed were 3 of the most sensational trials in Hollywood history. Trial 1, deadlock jury. Despite the lack of evidence, in testimony confirming Arbuckle never harmed Rappe, the jury couldn't agree. Public anger drowned out the truth. Trial 2, deadlocked again. Witnesses contradicted each other. Rumors spread faster than facts. Newspapers continued fabricating details to keep the scandal alive. Trial 3, full acquittal and an apology. On April 12, 1922, the jury returned not just a not guilty verdict, but a written apology, a rare gesture of absolute exoneration. They stated that Roscoe Arbuckle had been gravely wronged, but the apology came far too late. Hollywood didn't take him back. America didn't forgive him. The studios banned his films, canceled his contracts, and erased his name from marquees. The man proven innocent was treated as if he were guilty forever. Unable to return publicly, Arbuckle worked behind the scenes under a pseudonym, William Goodrich, a quiet, almost tragic symbol of what he had lost. His income shrank, his health deteriorated, his spirit dimmed. The laughter he once brought millions seemed to have been stolen from him. In 1933, the studios finally offered him a chance. He signed a contract with Warner Brothers to star in a new series of comedies. For the first time in a decade, Roscoe Arbuckle felt hope. He never lived to fulfill it. That same night, after celebrating his long-awaited comeback, Arbuckle suffered a heart attack and died in his sleep at the age of 46. A man proven innocent, broken by a crime he never committed, destroyed not by guilt, but by headlines, hysteria, and the cruelty of a world eager for a villain. His story is a reminder that in old Hollywood, the truth didn't always matter. The narrative did. Number 2, the golden boy who walked into Hollywood's most explosive trial. In the early 1940s, Errol Flynn was the closest thing America had to a real-life adventure hero. He wasn't just a movie star, he was a fantasy. The sword-fighting rogue, the mischievous charmer, the man who leapt from ships and climbed castle walls with a grin that promised danger and delight in the same breath. Women adored him. Men wanted to be him. Studios banked entire fortunes on his smile. And then, in 1942, that smile vanished from posters and reappeared on the front pages of every newspaper in the country. Two teenage girls, Betty Hansen and Peggy Satterlee, came forward with explosive accusations of statutory misconduct against Flynn. The allegations shook Hollywood to its core. America watched as their swashbuckling hero was suddenly yanked off the pedestal they had placed him on. The details were salacious enough to keep the press printing nonstop. Hearst newspapers in particular smelled blood and profit. They splashed Errol Flynn's scandal across headlines, painting him as a predator long before he ever set foot in a courtroom. For a moment, it seemed like Flynn's legendary career was over. When the trial began in early 1943, the courtroom became a spectacle worthy of Hollywood itself. Lines formed outside hours before the doors opened. Fans screamed for him as if it were a film premiere. Reporters elbowed each other for seats, desperate for every glance, gesture, or whisper. And Flynn played his role perfectly. He walked into the courtroom with the same swagger he brought to Captain Blood. He smiled, he joked, he winked at spectators. The press had tried to reduce him to a headline, but Flynn turned the trial into a performance, and he performed brilliantly. The prosecution's case quickly grew shaky. The girls' testimonies were inconsistent. Rumors of coaching circulated. Witnesses contradicted each other, and Flynn's high-powered lawyers exploited every flaw. But the most powerful force in the courtroom wasn't evidence or legal strategy. It was Errol Flynn himself. He radiated charm, confidence, and a devil-may-care confidence that made people want to believe him. His fans, mostly women, filled the gallery wearing buttons that read, "I'm for Flynn." The trial stretched for weeks, each day filled with sensational claims and dramatic cross-examinations. But on February 9, 1943, the jury delivered the verdict that echoed through Hollywood. Not guilty, acquitted on all counts. Flynn walked out of the courthouse a free man, legally at least. But even an acquittal couldn't erase the stain. His reputation was altered forever. The trial gave birth to a phrase that followed him for the rest of his life, "in like Flynn," a slang expression meaning quick success in romantic pursuits, the kind of dark, backhanded immortality that Hollywood specializes in. Some say the scandal changed him. He drank more. He partied harder. He leaned even further into the reckless persona the world now expected from him. Flynn continued making films, good ones, even great ones. But he was no longer the untouchable golden boy. There was always a shadow now, a whisper, a reminder of the trial that nearly ended him. He died in 1959 at just 50 years old, his body worn down by excess, his legend permanently tangled with controversy. Errol Flynn was acquitted, but he was never truly freed. In old Hollywood, sometimes the verdict mattered less than the story the world chose to believe. Number 3, Hedy Lamarr, the most beautiful woman in the world, reduced to a headline. Before the scandal, Hedy Lamarr seemed almost unreal. A woman whose beauty was so striking that even other actresses whispered about it. She arrived in Hollywood in the late 1930s like a force of nature. Luminous skin, sculpted cheekbones, eyes that looked like they were painted for the screen. Louis B. Mayer famously introduced her as the most beautiful woman in the world, and audiences believed it. But beneath the glamour was something far more impressive. Lamarr was a scientific mind, a restless thinker, an inventor. She worked late into the night, sketching designs, taking apart machines, dreaming of technology that would one day change the world. Hollywood never cared about that part. They wanted the beauty, not the brilliance. And when her life began to crack, they preferred the scandal over the truth. In 1966, long after her days as an A-list star, Hedy Lamarr walked into a department store in Los Angeles. She was older now, private, almost reclusive. Time had taken her fame, but not the curiosity that followed her. When security accused her of shoplifting cosmetics, the story exploded across the country within hours. Hedy Lamarr arrested for shoplifting. The headlines didn't mention her inventions. They didn't mention her wartime patents. They didn't mention her brilliance. They mentioned her beauty and her downfall. Lamarr insisted it was a misunderstanding. She said the items had been placed in her bag by mistake, and within days the charge was dropped entirely. Legally, the case should have ended there. But Hollywood's cruelty never needed a courtroom. The press weaponized her age, her fading career, her vulnerability. Gossip columnists mocked her, calling the arrest a sad end, or proof that even the brightest stars fade badly. Television hosts made jokes. Audiences who once adored her now consumed her humiliation like entertainment. But what they didn't know, or chose not to see, was the quiet tragedy behind the headlines. Hedy Lamarr had spent years battling loneliness, disappointment, and the emotional aftermath of a lifetime of being seen but never understood. Hollywood had celebrated her appearance but dismissed her intellect. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping communication system designed to protect Allied torpedoes from enemy signal jamming. Her technology would eventually become the foundation for Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS. Yenna, the woman mocked for a shoplifting misunderstanding, helped invent the wireless world. But in the 1960s, no one cared. Not the studios, not the public, not the industry she had once dazzled. Her arrest became a symbol, not of criminality, but of how brutally Hollywood treated aging women. Where Paul Kelly was forgiven, where Robert Mitchum became a legend, Hedy Lamarr was discarded the moment her beauty was no longer enough. After the scandal, Lamarr withdrew from public life almost completely. She lived quietly, avoiding cameras, interviews, and attention. For decades, she was a ghost. A woman whose face had once sold millions of movie tickets, now forgotten by the very machine she had fueled. But time has a way of rewriting history. By the late 1990s, her inventions were finally recognized. Engineers, scientists, and historians credited her contributions to modern communication technology. She received awards, tributes, and acknowledgments, most of them arriving too late for her to fully enjoy. Hedy Lamarr died in 2000, not as a shoplifter, not as a scandal, but as a woman whose brilliance had been ignored in life and celebrated only in death. Her story is one of Hollywood's greatest tragedies, a reminder that beauty may open doors, but brilliance is often the thing the world refuses to see. Number 4. Lionel Atwill, the gentleman of horror brought down by a single lie. Before the scandal, Lionel Atwill was Hollywood royalty of a very particular kind. The gentleman of horror. With his aristocratic voice, sharp features, and commanding presence, Atwill elevated every role he touched. Whether he played a mad doctor, a sinister scientist, or a calculating murderer, he approached each performance with elegance, intelligence, and precision. Critics admired him. Audiences respected him. Directors trusted him. But it wasn't a role that destroyed him. It was a moment of fear, and a single lie that spiraled into the end of his career. It began quietly in 1942, with whispers surrounding a private party at Atwill's Los Angeles home. The gathering, attended by industry colleagues and acquaintances, was meant to be discreet. A night of drinks, music, and adult indulgence away from the studio system's watchful eye. But when police investigated an unrelated matter, rumors spread that the party had been more scandalous than anyone admitted. Hollywood panicked. The industry was already under pressure from morality groups and government watchdogs. Any hint of impropriety, especially of the sexual kind, could trigger investigations that threatened the studio's carefully crafted, family-friendly image. And Lionel Atwill, unfortunately, was in the center of the storm. When questioned, Atwill provided testimony downplaying the nature of the gathering. He omitted details, softened the edges, and attempted to protect both himself and his guests. It wasn't a dramatic attempt to deceive. It wasn't even malicious. But in the eyes of the law, and in the era of moral panic, it was enough. Atwill was charged with perjury, accused of giving false and evasive testimony. The trial was swift. The prosecution framed him not as a criminal mastermind, but as a man who had misled the court to hide something sordid. Whether that was true hardly mattered. The scandal had already taken on a life of its own. In a desperate attempt to limit damage, Atwill revised his statements, clarifying details he had previously softened. It wasn't enough. He pleaded guilty to the charge and was sentenced to 5 years of probation. No prison time, no violent crime, no dramatic downfall. But Hollywood didn't care about the severity. They cared about the stain. Studios severed ties instantly. Contracts vanished. Directors stopped calling. Insurance companies refused to cover any film that hired him. This was the silent punishment, the one far more devastating than a jail sentence. The industry that once embraced him now treated his name like a liability. Atwill, humiliated but determined, tried to work again. And for a time he succeeded, but only in low-budget productions, small horror pictures that relied more on his voice than his reputation. Gone were the prestige roles, the Universal Pictures contracts, the dignified characters he once mastered. He became a shadow of the star he had been. By the mid-1940s, his health began to decline. Once strong and stately, he now fought through exhaustion and illness to continue acting. He refused to quit, perhaps because work was the only part of his identity Hollywood hadn't stripped from him. Lionel Atwill died in 1946, not disgraced, not forgotten, but diminished. A man whose legacy was overshadowed by one mistake in a time when Hollywood demanded perfection. His story is quieter than many on this list. There was no shocking crime, no sensational arrest, no violent scandal. Only a man cornered by fear, punished by a system that found it easier to destroy him than to understand him. In the end, Lionel Atwill wasn't ruined by wrongdoing. He was ruined by Hollywood's terror of imperfection, and the lie told to protect a truth the world wasn't ready to hear. Number 5, Clara Bow, the it girl destroyed by lies, gossip, and a world that wanted to break her. Before Marilyn Monroe, before Jean Harlow, before the era of blonde bombshells defined Hollywood glamour, there was Clara Bow, the original it girl. She wasn't trained, polished, or molded by the studios. She didn't need to be. Clara possessed something far more powerful, a raw magnetism that leapt off the screen and straight into the hearts of millions. Her smile lit up silent film frames. Her energy reshaped the idea of what a movie star could be. And in the mid-1920s, she was the most famous woman in America. But fame attracts shadows, and Clara's shadow swallowed her whole. Unlike many stars of her era, Bow didn't come from wealth, privilege, or connections. She grew up in poverty in Brooklyn, surviving a childhood filled with trauma most people couldn't imagine. When she arrived in Hollywood, she didn't understand its politics, and she didn't know the rules designed to crush anyone too genuine, too open, too alive. Gossip columnists studied her like predators. Studio executives envied her independence. Jealous rivals whispered that she was too wild, too free, too real. And then came Daisy DeVoe. DeVoe was Bow's personal secretary, a woman who knew her routines, her anxieties, her weaknesses, and who held access to her private correspondence. In 1931, after Clara fired her for financial misconduct, DeVoe retaliated with a scandal so vicious it nearly destroyed Bow's mind. She accused Clara of almost everything: gambling, drug use, sexual misconduct, immoral behavior. Each claim more sensational than the last. None of it was backed by evidence. Most of it was pure invention. But in an era where Hollywood gossip columns sold more newspapers than actual news, facts didn't matter. The trial that followed wasn't about justice. It was a public dissection. DeVoe was ultimately convicted of grand theft. Not Clara, but the damage had already been done. The newspapers printed every lie in bold letters and buried the corrections in tiny print weeks later. Fan magazines mocked her. Columnists called her unstable, uncontrolled, morally unfit. Clara Bow, the biggest star of her generation, became a spectacle. Silent Hollywood had forgiven much worse from its male actors, but Clara was a woman who lived freely, and that was a crime the system refused to allow. The relentless humiliation began to break her. The joy she once brought to the screen was swallowed by anxiety, insomnia, and public scrutiny. Her final films were haunted by a sadness her fans didn't understand. Studio executives, once desperate to cast her in everything, quietly backed away. And then at only 26 years old, Clara Bow walked away from Hollywood. No grand farewell, no dramatic exit, just a young woman exhausted by fame she never asked for. She spent the next decades living quietly on a Nevada ranch with her husband, cowboy actor Rex Bell. She raised two sons. She avoided cameras, and she rarely spoke of the industry that had once worshipped her, then devoured her. When Clara Bow died in 1965, Hollywood remembered her as a star, but not a survivor, not a victim, not a woman who fought a war against gossip, misogyny, and the cruelty of a system built to break women like her. Today, her story stands as one of the clearest examples of how old Hollywood didn't just make icons. It destroyed them with equal passion. Clara Bow wasn't defeated by scandal. She was defeated by lies. Number 6. Tallulah Bankhead, Hollywood's wildest woman who refused to be controlled. Before scandal defined her, Tallulah Bankhead was a storm wrapped in silk, a woman so impossibly charismatic that entire rooms fell silent when she walked in. Born into political privilege in Alabama, she could have lived a safe, scripted life. Instead, she ran toward chaos with open arms and a cigarette balanced between two perfectly manicured fingers. Tallulah wasn't just a star, she was a force of nature. When she arrived in Hollywood in the early 1930s, the studio executives had no idea what to do with her. She swore like a sailor. She drank like prohibition had never happened. She seduced whoever she wanted, regardless of what the morality police or the press thought. And she delivered lines with a husky, magnetic voice that seemed impossible for the microphone to tame. She was everything Hollywood feared, and everything it desperately wanted. But Tallulah Bankhead's war wasn't with the law, it was with the rules. In an era when actresses were expected to be polished, wholesome, and tightly managed, Tallulah did the opposite. She mocked the production code, partied with gangsters, flirted with scandal, and gave interviews so outrageous they became legend. She once told a reporter, "My heart was not in the film, my lungs were." It was the kind of comment that made producers wince and audiences laugh, but the chaos that made her famous also made her vulnerable. By the mid-1930s, tabloids circled her like vultures. Every night out became a headline. Every rumor became truth. Every joke became evidence that she wasn't fit for stardom. In a world terrified of morally complicated women, Tallulah was the most complicated woman of all. Her private life became public sport. Her drinking was mocked. Her relationships were sensationalized. Her sexuality, fluid, unapologetic, became the favorite target of gossip columnists hungry for scandal. When she clashed with a producer, newspapers printed it. When she fired a maid, they printed that too. When she showed up late to rehearsals, it became proof that she was out of control. The truth is that Tallulah Bankhead didn't face a single career-ending scandal. She faced 1,000 small assassinations, delivered daily by an industry terrified of a woman who refused to behave. One of the most damaging blows came when she contracted a severe, life-threatening case of venereal disease in 1933. She nearly died, required a hysterectomy, and was hospitalized for weeks. When the story leaked, the press didn't treat her as a patient. They treated her as entertainment. Her medical tragedy became a punchline. Hollywood turned its back. Studios deemed her unreliable and uninsurable, the same labels that destroyed Lawrence Tierney decades later. Offers vanished, roles dried up. Directors refused to gamble on a woman who wouldn't play nice. For a moment, it seemed like the industry had won. Tallulah Bankhead, the wildest woman in Hollywood, had been silenced. But Tallulah refused to disappear. She went back to the stage, where she delivered some of the finest performances of her life, including Hitchcock's Lifeboat, a role that revived her career and earned her the deepest respect she had ever received. She performed brilliantly, dangerously, fearlessly, the way she always had. Tallulah Bankhead didn't lose her career to a single mistake. She lost it to a system that demanded obedience, and to a world not ready for a woman who lived louder than the spotlight. To the end of her life, she remained unapologetic. Tallulah didn't fall from grace. She jumped, laughing, and dared Hollywood to follow. Number 7, Charlie Chaplin, the man who made the world laugh, then became its enemy. Long before the scandal, Charlie Chaplin was untouchable. The little tramp, bowler hat, cane, mustache, was more than a character. He was a symbol of hope. During the darkest years of the Great Depression, Chaplin's films brought laughter to a world drowning in despair. Children adored him, adults admired him, critics worshipped him. He wasn't just the most famous comedian alive. He was one of the most recognizable human beings on the planet. But Hollywood has a cruel habit of turning icons into targets. And Chaplin's fall wasn't caused by a single mistake, but by a perfect storm of scandal, politics, and fear. It began in 1944 with a case that should never have become a national obsession. Joan Barry, a troubled and often unstable actress who had once auditioned for Chaplin, accused him of inappropriate behavior and filed a paternity claim. He insisted the affair never happened. Barry's own history contradicted her accusations. Yet the moment her story hit the newspapers, Chaplin, the man who had built his life on the illusion of innocence, became front-page material for all the wrong reasons. The government stepped in, not to seek justice, but to seek headlines. The FBI, already suspicious of Chaplin's political leanings, saw an opportunity. J. Edgar Hoover despised him, his foreign birth, his left-leaning politics, his influence. Hoover believed Chaplin was dangerous, subversive, a threat to America's moral and political stability. The Barry case became the perfect weapon. Chaplin was charged under the Mann Act, accused of transporting Barry across state lines for immoral purposes. It was a sensational accusation. Dramatic, salacious, perfect for tabloids. The trial became less about Barry and more about Chaplin's fate as a public figure. In reality, the evidence was flimsy. The encounter was consensual. The paternity test later proved he was not the father. The court eventually cleared him of all charges, but the damage was already done. The headlines had done their work, and then came the political storm. Chaplin spoke openly against fascism before most of Hollywood dared to. He criticized McCarthyism. He refused to become an American citizen. He used his films, most notably The Great Dictator, to speak out about war, power, and dictatorship. Many called him brave. Others called him dangerous. By the early 1950s, the anti-communist panic was at its peak. Hollywood was terrified. Politicians were desperate for enemies. And Chaplin, a foreign-born artist who championed the working class, was an easy target. In 1952, while traveling to London for the premiere of Limelight, Chaplin received a message from the U.S. government. His re-entry permit had been revoked. America had exiled him. The little tramp, who had once made the world laugh, now found himself unwanted by the country that had made him a legend. Chaplin settled in Switzerland, where he would live the rest of his life, a world away from the studios he once ruled. He continued making films, but the magic was dimmed. Hollywood had turned its back. The United States had erased him from its story. The political climate that once cheered for his comedy now cheered for his departure. Charlie Chaplin died in 1977, wealthy, respected in Europe, surrounded by family, but forever marked by the exile that Hollywood and Washington forced upon him. His story is the final lesson of Eric II. You don't need to commit a crime to be punished in old Hollywood. Sometimes the world just needs a reason, and a man too brilliant to silence. The stars in this chapter didn't serve a day behind bars. They weren't locked in cells or marched into prison yards or photographed in mugshots that circled the world. Their punishment was quieter, but far more devastating. They were tried by gossip columns, sentenced by headlines, exiled by a public that demanded perfection, and destroyed anyone who dared to fall short. Some were innocent, some were complicated, some were guilty only of being human. But in old Hollywood, that was enough to end a career, because the studios could hide a crime, but they couldn't outrun a scandal. And yet, there is a third kind of story, darker, lonelier, and far more tragic. The stories of actors who were never charged, never tried, never even given the chance to defend themselves, because they were destroyed by rumors, secrets, and mysteries that Hollywood buried deep. Part 3 begins with the stars whose lives unraveled not in courtrooms, but in whispers.